Chapter 2, Part 2 of The Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1783, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Meanwhile, the two maritime states, England and Holland, though eyeing France distrustfully, had greater and growing grudges against each other, which under the fostering care of Charles II led to war. The true cause was doubtless commercial jealousy, and the conflict sprang immediately from collisions between the trading companies. Hostilities began on the west coast of Africa, and an English squadron in 1664, after subduing several Dutch stations there, sailed to New Amsterdam, now New York, and seized it. All these affairs took place before the formal declaration of war in February 1665. This war was undoubtedly popular in England. The instinct of the people found an expression by the lips of Monk, who is reported to have said, "What matters this or that reason? What we want is more of the trade which the Dutch now have." There is also little room to doubt that, despite the pretensions of the trading companies, the government of the United Provinces would gladly have avoided the war. The able man who was at their head saw too clearly the delicate position in which they stood between England and France. They claimed, however, the support of the latter in virtue of a defensive treaty made in 1662. Louis allowed the claim, but unwillingly, and the still young navy of France gave practically no help. The war between the two sea states was wholly maritime, and had the general characteristics of all such wars. Three great battles were fought: the first off Lowestoft on the Norfolk coast, June 13, 1665; the second, known as the 4 days' battle in the Straits of Dover, often spoken of by French writers as that of the Pas de Calais, lasting from the 11th to the 14th of June, 1666; and the third off the North Foreland, August 4 of the same year. In the first and last of these the English had a decided success; in the second the advantage remained with the Dutch. This one only will be described at length, because of it alone has been found such a full, coherent account as will allow a clear and accurate tactical narrative to be given. There are in these fights points of interest more generally applicable to the present day than are the details of somewhat obsolete tactical movements. In the first battle off Lowestoft, it appears that the Dutch commander Opdam, who was not a seaman but a cavalry officer, had very positive orders to fight. The discretion proper to a commander-in-chief on the spot was not entrusted to him. To interfere thus with the commander in the field or afloat is one of the most common temptations to the government in the cabinet, and is generally disastrous. Tourville, the greatest of Louis XIV.'s admirals, was forced thus to risk the whole French navy against his own judgment; and a century later a great French fleet escaped from the English admiral Keith through his obedience to imperative orders from his immediate superior, who was sick in port. In the Lowestoft fight the Dutch van gave way, and a little later one of the junior admirals of the centre, Opdam's own squadron, being killed, the crew was seized with a panic, took the command of the ship from her officers, and carried her out of action. This movement was followed by 12 or 13 other ships, leaving a great gap in the Dutch line. The occurrence shows, what has before been pointed out, that the discipline of the Dutch fleet and the tone of the officers were not high, despite the fine fighting qualities of the nation, and although it is probably true that there were more good seamen among the Dutch than among the English captains. The natural steadfastness and heroism of the Hollanders could not wholly supply that professional pride and sense of military honor which it is the object of sound military institutions to encourage. Popular feeling in the United States is pretty much at sea in this matter. There is with it no intermediate step between personal courage with a gun in its hand and entire military efficiency. Opdam, seeing the battle going against him, seems to have yielded to a feeling approaching despair. He sought to grapple the English commander in chief, who on this day was the Duke of York, the king's brother. He failed in this, and in the desperate struggle which followed, his ship blew up. Shortly after, 3, or as one account says 4, Dutch ships ran foul of one another, and this group was burned by one fire ship. 3 or 4 others singly met the same fate a little later. The Dutch fleet was now in disorder, and retreated under cover of the squadron of Van Tromp, son of the famous old admiral who in the days of the Commonwealth sailed through the Channel with a broom at his masthead. Fire ships are seen here to have played a very conspicuous part, more so certainly than in the War of 1653, though at both periods they formed an appendage to the fleet. There is on the surface an evident resemblance between the rôle of the fire ship and the part assigned in modern warfare to the torpedo cruiser. The terrible character of the attack, the comparative smallness of the vessel making it, and the large demands upon the nerve of the assailant are the chief points of resemblance. The great points of difference are the comparative certainty with which the modern vessel can be handled, which is partly met by the same advantage in the ironclad over the old ship of the line, and the instantaneousness of the injury by torpedo, whose attack fails or succeeds at once, whereas that of the fire ship required time for effecting the object, which in both cases is total destruction of the hostile ship, instead of crippling or otherwise reducing it. An appreciation of the character of fire ships, of the circumstances under which they attained their greatest usefulness, and of the causes which led to their disappearance, may perhaps help in the decision to which nations must come as to whether the torpedo cruiser, pure and simple, is a type of weapon destined to survive in fleets. A French officer who has been examining the records of the French navy states that the fire ship first appears incorporated as an arm of the fleet in 1636. Whether specially built for the purpose, or whether altered from other purposes to be fitted for their particular end, they received a special equipment. The command was given to officers not noble, with the grade of captain of fire ship. 5 subordinate officers and 25 seamen made up the crew. Easily known by grappling irons, which were always fitted to their yards, the fire ship saw its rôle growing less in the early years of the 18th century. It was finally to disappear from the fleets whose speed it delayed and whose evolutions were by it complicated. As the ships of war grew larger, their action in concert with fire ships became daily more difficult. On the other hand, there had already been abandoned the idea of combining them with the fighting ships to form a few groups, each provided with all the means of attack and defence. The formation of the close-hauled line of battle, by assigning the fire ships a place in a second line, placed half a league on the side farthest from the enemy, made them more and more unfitted to fulfil their office. The official plan of the Battle of Malaga, 1704, drawn up immediately after the battle, shows the fire ship in this position as laid down by Paul Hoste. Finally, the use of shells, enabling ships to be set on fire more surely and quickly, and introduced on board at the period of which we are now treating, though the general use did not obtain until much later, was the last blow to the fire ship. Those who are familiar with the theories and discussions of our own day on the subject of fleet tactics and weapons will recognize in this short notice of a long obsolete type certain ideas which are not obsolete. The fire ship disappeared from fleets whose speed it delayed. In heavy weather, small bulk must always mean comparatively small speed. In a moderate sea, we are now told the speed of the torpedo boat falls from 20 knots to 15 or less, and the 17 to 19 knot cruiser can either run away from the pursuing boats or else hold them at a distance under fire of machine and heavy guns. These boats are sea-going, and it is thought can keep the sea in all weathers; but to be on board a 110-foot torpedo boat when the sea is lively is said to be far from agreeable. The heat, noise, and rapid vibrations of the engines are intense. Cooking seems to be out of the question, and it is said that if food were well cooked, few would be able to appreciate it. To obtain necessary rest under these conditions, added to the rapid motions of the boat, is most difficult. Larger boats are to be built, but the factor of loss of speed in rough weather will remain, unless the size of the torpedo cruiser is increased to a point that will certainly lead to fitting them with something more than torpedoes. Like fire ships, small torpedo cruisers will delay the speed and complicate the evolutions of the fleet with which they are associated. The disappearance of the fire ship was also hastened, we are told, by the introduction of shell firing, or incendiary projectiles, and it is not improbable that for deep-sea fighting the transfer of the torpedo to a class of larger ships will put an end to the mere torpedo cruiser. The fire ship continued to be used against fleets at anchor down to the days of the American Civil War, and the torpedo boat will always be useful within an easy distance of its port. A third phase of naval practice 200 years ago, mentioned in the extract quoted, involves an idea very familiar to modern discussions, namely the group formation. The idea of combining fire ships with the fighting ships to form a few groups, each provided with all the means of attack and defence, was for a time embraced, for we are told that it was later on abandoned. The combining of the ships of a fleet into groups of 2, 3, or 4, meant to act specially together, is now largely favored in England, less so in France, where it meets strong opposition. No question of this sort, ably advocated on either side, is to be settled by one man's judgment, nor until time and experience have applied their infallible tests. It may be remarked, however, that in a well organized fleet there are 2 degrees of command which are in themselves both natural and necessary, that can be neither done away nor ignored. These are the command of the whole fleet as one unit, and the command of each ship as a unit in itself. When a fleet becomes too large to be handled by one man, it must be subdivided, and in the heat of action become practically 2 fleets acting to one common end. As Nelson in his noble order at Trafalgar said, "The second in command will, after my intentions are made known to him," mark the force of the after, which so well protects the functions both of the commander in chief and the second, have the entire direction of his line to make the attack upon the enemy, and to follow up the blow until they are captured or destroyed. The size and cost of the individual ironclad of the present day makes it unlikely that fleets will be so numerous as to require subdivision; but whether they are or not does not affect the decision of the group question. Looking simply to the principle underlying the theory, and disregarding the seeming tactical clumsiness of the special groups proposed, the question is, shall there be introduced between the natural commands of the admiral and of the captains of the individual ships a third artificial contrivance, which on the one hand will in effect partly supersede the supreme authority, and on the other will partly fetter the discretion of commanders of ships? A further difficulty springing from the narrow principle of support, specially due to particular ships, on which the group system rests, is this, that when signals can no longer be seen, the duty of the captain to his own ship and to the fleet at large will be complicated by his duty to observe certain relations to particular ships, which particular ships must in time come to have undue prominence in his views. The group formation had its day of trial in old times, and disappeared before the test of experience. Whether in its restored form it will survive, time will show. It may be said, before quitting the subject, that as an order of sailing, corresponding to the route step of an army in march, a loose group formation has some advantages, maintaining some order without requiring that rigid exactness of position, to observe which by day and night must be a severe strain on captain and deck officers. Such a route order should not, however, be permitted until a fleet has reached high tactical precision. To return to the question of fire ships and torpedo boats, the rôle of the latter, it is often said, is to be found in that mêlée which is always to succeed a couple of headlong passes between the opposing fleets. In the smoke and confusion of that hour is the opportunity of the torpedo boat. This certainly sounds plausible, and the torpedo vessel certainly has a power of movement not possessed by the fire ship. A mêlée of the two fleets, however, was not the condition most favorable for the fire ship. I shall quote here from another French officer, whose discussion of these Anglo-Dutch sea fights in a late periodical is singularly clear and suggestive. He says: "Far from impeding the direct action of the fire ship, which was naught or nearly so during the confused battles of the War of 1652, the regularity and ensemble newly attained in the movements of squadrons seem rather to favor it. The fire ships played a very important part at the battles of Lowestoft, Pas de Calais, and the North Foreland. Thanks to the good order preserved by the ships of the line, these incendiary ships can indeed be better protected by the artillery, much more efficiently directed than before toward a distinct and determined end." In the midst of the confused mêlées of 1652, the fire ship acted, so to speak, alone, seeking by chance an enemy to grapple, running the risk of a mistake, without protection against the guns of the enemy, nearly sure to be sunk by him, or else burned uselessly. All now in 1665 has become different. Its prey is clearly pointed out. It knows it, follows it easily into the relatively fixed position had by it in the enemy's line. On the other hand, the ships of his own division do not lose sight of the fire ship. They accompany it as far as possible, cover it with their artillery to the end of its course, and disengage it before burning, if the fruitlessness of the attempt is seen soon enough. Evidently, under such conditions, its action, always uncertain, it cannot be otherwise, nevertheless acquires greater chances of success. These instructive comments need perhaps the qualifying or additional remark that confusion in the enemy's order at the time that your own remains good gives the best opening for a desperate attack. The writer goes on to trace the disappearance of the fire ship. Here, then, we see the fire ship at the point of its highest importance. That importance will decrease, the fire ship itself will end by disappearing from engagements in the open sea, when naval artillery, becoming more perfect, shall have greater range, be more accurate and more rapid, when ships receiving better forms, greater steering power, more extensive and better balanced sail power, shall be able, thanks to quicker speed and handling, to avoid almost certainly the fire ships sent against them. When finally fleets led on principles of tactics as skilful as they were timid, a tactics which will predominate a century later during the whole War of American Independence, when these fleets, in order not to jeopardize the perfect regularity of their order of battle, will avoid coming to close quarters, and will leave to the cannon alone to decide the fate of an action. In this discussion, the writer has in view the leading feature which, while aiding the action of the fire ship, also gives this War of 1665 its peculiar interest in the history of naval tactics. In it is found for the first time the close-hauled line of battle, undeniably adopted as the fighting order of the fleets. It is plain enough that when those fleets numbered, as they often did, from 80 to 100 ships, such lines would be very imperfectly formed in every essential, both of line and interval. but the general aim is evident amid whatever imperfections of execution. The credit for this development is generally given to the Duke of York, afterward James II. But the question to whom the improvement is due is of little importance to sea officers of the present day when compared with the instructive fact that so long a time elapsed between the appearance of the large sailing ship with its broadside battery and the systematic adoption of the order which was best adapted to develop the full power of the fleet for mutual support. To us, having the elements of the problem in our hands, together with the result finally reached, that result seems simple enough, almost self-evident. Why did it take so long for the capable men of that day to reach it? The reason, and herein lies the lesson for the officer of to day, was doubtless the same that leaves the order of battle so uncertain now, namely, that the necessity of war did not force men to make up their minds until the Dutch at last met in the English, their equals on the sea. The sequence of ideas which resulted in the line of battle is clear and logical. Though familiar enough to seamen, it will be here stated in the words of the writer last quoted, because they have a neatness and precision entirely French. With the increase of power of the ship of war, and with the perfecting of its sea and warlike qualities, there has come an equal progress in the art of utilizing them. As naval evolutions become more skilful, their importance grows from day to day. To these evolutions there is needed a base, a point from which they depart and to which they return. A fleet of warships must be always ready to meet an enemy. Logically, therefore, this point of departure for naval evolutions must be the order of battle. Now, since the disappearance of galleys, almost all the artillery is found upon the sides of a ship of war. Hence it is the beam that must necessarily and always be turned toward the enemy. On the other hand, it is necessary that the sight of the latter must never be interrupted by a friendly ship. Only one formation allows the ships of the same fleet to satisfy fully these conditions. That formation is the line ahead column. This line, therefore, is imposed as the only order of battle, and consequently as the basis of all fleet tactics. In order that this order of battle, this long, thin line of guns, may not be injured or broken at some point weaker than the rest, there is at the same time felt the necessity of putting in it only ships which, if not of equal force, have at least equally strong sides. Logically, it follows, at the same moment in which the line ahead became definitively the order for battle, there was established the distinction between the ships of the line, alone destined for a place therein, and the lighter ships meant for other uses. If to these we add the considerations which led to making the line of battle a close-hauled line, we have the problem fully worked out. But the chain of reasoning was as clear 250 years ago as it is now. Why, then, was it so long in being worked out? Partly, no doubt, because old traditions, in those days traditions of galley fighting, had hold of and confused men's minds, chiefly because men are too indolent to seek out the foundation truths of the situation in their day and develop the true theory of action from its base up. As a rare instance of clear-sightedness, recognizing such a fundamental change in conditions and predicting results, words of Admiral La Brousse of the French navy, written in 1840, are most instructive. "Thanks to steam," he wrote, "ships will be able to move in any direction with such speed that the effects of collision may, and indeed must, as they formerly did, take the place of projectile weapons, and annul the calculations of the skilful manoeuvre. The ram will be favorable to speed without destroying the nautical qualities of a ship. As soon as one power shall have adopted this terrible weapon, all others must accept it, under pain of evident inferiority, and thus combats will become combats of ram against ram. while forbearing the unconditional adhesion to the ram as the controlling weapon of the day, which the French navy has yielded, the above brief argument may well be taken as an instance of the way in which researches into the order of battle of the future should be worked out. A French writer commenting on Labrousse's paper says: 27 years were scarce enough for our fathers, counting from 1638, the date of building the Couronne, to 1665, to pass from the tactical order of the line abreast, the order for galleys, to that of the line ahead. We ourselves needed 29 years, from 1830, when the first steamship was brought into our fleet, to 1859, when the application of the principle of ram fighting was affirmed by laying down the Solferino and the Magenta to work a revolution in the contrary direction. So true it is that truth is always slow in getting to the light. This transformation was not sudden, not only because the new material required time to be built and armed, but above all, it is sad to say, because the necessary consequences of the new motive power escaped most minds. We come now to the justly celebrated 4 days' battle of June, 1666, which claims special notice, not only on account of the great number of ships engaged on either side, nor yet only for the extraordinary physical endurance of the men who kept up a hot naval action for so many successive days, but also because the commanders in chief on either side, Monk and de Ruyter, were the most distinguished seamen, or rather sea commanders, brought forth by their respective countries in the 17th century. Monk was possibly inferior to Blake in the annals of the English navy, but there is a general agreement that de Ruyter is the foremost figure, not only in the Dutch service, but among all the naval officers of that age. The account about to be given is mainly taken from a recent number of the Revue Maritime et Coloniale, and is there published as a letter, recently discovered, from a Dutch gentleman serving as a volunteer on board de Ruyter's ship, to a friend in France. The narrative is delightfully clear and probable, qualities not generally found in the description of those long ago fights, and the satisfaction it gave was increased by finding in the memoirs of the Count de Guiche, who also served as volunteer in the fleet, and was taken to de Ruyter after his own vessel had been destroyed by a fire ship, an account confirming the former in its principal details. This additional pleasure was unhappily marred by recognizing certain phrases as common to both stories, and a comparison showed that the two could not be accepted as independent narratives. There are, however, points of internal difference which make it possible that the two accounts are by different eye-witnesses, who compared and corrected their versions before sending them out to their friends or writing them in their journals. The numbers of the two fleets were: English about 80 ships, the Dutch about 100, but the inequality in numbers was largely compensated by the greater size of many of the English. A great strategic blunder by the government in London immediately preceded the fight. The king was informed that a French squadron was on its way from the Atlantic to join the Dutch. He at once divided his fleet, sending 20 ships under Prince Rupert to the westward to meet the French, while the remainder under Monk were to go east and oppose the Dutch. A position like that of the English fleet, threatened with an attack from two quarters, presents one of the subtlest temptations to a commander. The impulse is very strong to meet both by dividing his own numbers, as Charles did; but unless in possession of overwhelming force, it is an error, exposing both divisions to be beaten separately, which, as we are about to see, actually happened in this case. The result of the first 2 days was disastrous to the larger English division under Monk, which was then obliged to retreat toward Rupert, and probably the opportune return of the latter alone saved the English fleet from a very serious loss, or at the least from being shut up in their own ports. 140 years later, in the exciting game of strategy that was played in the Bay of Biscay before Trafalgar, the English admiral Cornwallis made precisely the same blunder, dividing his fleet into two equal parts out of supporting distance, which Napoleon at the time characterized as a glaring piece of stupidity. The lesson is the same in all ages. The Dutch had sailed for the English coast with a fair easterly wind, but it changed later to southwest with thick weather, and freshened so that De Ruyter, to avoid being driven too far, came to anchor between Dunkirk and the Downs. The fleet then rode with its head to the south-southwest, and the van on the right, while Tromp, who commanded the rear division in the natural order, was on the left. For some cause this left was most to windward, the centre squadron under Ruyter being to leeward, and the right or van to leeward again of the centre. This was the position of the Dutch fleet at daylight of June 11, 1666, and although not expressly so stated, it is likely from the whole tenor of the narratives that it was not in good order. The same morning Monk, who was also at anchor, made out the Dutch fleet to leeward, and although so inferior in numbers, determined to attack at once, hoping that by keeping the advantage of the wind he would be able to commit himself only so far as might seem best. He therefore stood along the Dutch line on the starboard tack, leaving the right and centre out of cannon shot, until he came abreast of the left, Tromp's squadron. Monk then had 35 ships well in hand, but the rear had opened and was straggling, as is apt to be the case with long columns. With the 35 he then put his helm up and ran down for Tromp, whose squadron cut their cables and made sail on the same tack. The two engaged lines thus standing over toward the French coast, and the breeze heeling the ships so that the English could not use their lower deck guns, the Dutch centre and rear also cut and followed the movement, but being so far to leeward, could not for some time come into action. It was during this time that a large Dutch ship, becoming separated from her own fleet, was set on fire and burned, doubtless the ship in which was Count de Guiche. As they drew near Dunkirk, the English went about probably all together, for in the return to the northward and westward the proper English van fell in with and was roughly handled by the Dutch centre under Ruyter himself. This fate would be more likely to befall the rear, and indicates that a simultaneous movement had reversed the order. The engaged ships had naturally lost to leeward, thus enabling Ruyter to fetch up with them. 2 English flagships were here disabled and cut off. One, the Swiftsure, hauled down her colors after the admiral, a young man of only 27, was killed. Highly to be admired, says a contemporary writer, was the resolution of Vice Admiral Barclay, who, though cut off from the line, surrounded by enemies, great numbers of his men killed, his ship disabled and boarded on all sides, yet continued fighting almost alone, killed several with his own hand, and would accept no quarter, till at length, being shot in the throat with a musket ball, he retired into the captain's cabin, where he was found dead, extended at his full length upon a table, and almost covered with his own blood. Quite as heroic, but more fortunate in its issue, was the conduct of the other English admiral thus cut off, and the incidents of his struggle, though not specially instructive otherwise, are worth quoting, as giving a lively picture of the scenes which passed in the heat of the contests of those days, and afford coloring to otherwise dry details. Being in a short time completely disabled, one of the enemy's fire ships grappled him on the starboard quarter. He was, however, freed by the almost incredible exertions of his lieutenant, who, having in the midst of the flames loosed the grappling irons, swung back on board his own ship unhurt. The Dutch, bent on the destruction of this unfortunate ship, sent a second, which grappled her on the larboard side, and with greater success than the former; for the sails instantly taking fire, the crew were so terrified that nearly 50 of them jumped overboard. The admiral, Sir John Harman, seeing this confusion, ran with his sword drawn among those who remained, and threatened with instant death the first man who should attempt to quit the ship, or should not exert himself to quench the flames. The crew then returned to their duty and got the fire under, but the rigging being a good deal burned, one of the topsail yards fell and broke Sir John's leg. In the midst of this accumulated distress, a third fire ship prepared to grapple him, but was sunk by the guns before she could effect her purpose. The Dutch vice admiral, Evertsen, now bore down to him and offered quarter, but Sir John replied, "No, no, it has not come to that yet," and giving him a broadside, killed the Dutch commander, after which the other enemies sheered off. It is therefore not surprising that the account we have been following reported 2 English flagships lost, one by a fire ship. The English chief still continued on the port tack, and, says the writer, as night fell, we could see him proudly leading his line past the squadron of North Holland and Zealand, the actual rear but proper van, which from noon up to that time had not been able to reach the enemy from their leewardly position. The merit of Monk's attack as a piece of grand tactics is evident, and bears a strong resemblance to that of Nelson at the Nile. Discerning quickly the weakness of the Dutch order, he had attacked a vastly superior force in such a way that only part of it could come into action; and though the English actually lost more heavily, they carried off a brilliant prestige, and must have left considerable depression and heart burning among the Dutch. The eye-witness goes on: "The affair continued until 10 P.M., friends and foes mixed together, and as likely to receive injury from one as from the other. It will be remarked that the success of the day and the misfortunes of the English came from their being too much scattered, too extended in their line, but for which we could never have cut off a corner of them as we did. The mistake of Monk was in not keeping his ships better together, that is, closed up. The remark is just, the criticism scarcely so. The opening out of the line was almost unavoidable in so long a column of sailing ships, and was one of the chances taken by Monk when he offered battle. The English stood off on the port tack to the west or west-northwest, and next day returned to the fight. The Dutch were now on the port tack in natural order, the right leading, and were to windward; but the enemy, being more weatherly and better disciplined, soon gained the advantage of the wind. The English this day had 44 ships in action, the Dutch about 80, many of the English, as before said, larger. The 2 fleets passed on opposite tacks, the English to windward, but Tromp in the rear, seeing that the Dutch order of battle was badly formed, the ships in 2 or 3 lines, overlapping and so masking each other's fire, went about and gained to windward of the enemy's van, which he was able to do from the length of the line, and because the English, running parallel to the Dutch order, were off the wind. At this moment 2 flag officers of the Dutch van kept broad off, presenting their sterns to the English. Ruyter, greatly astonished, tried to stop them, but in vain, and therefore felt obliged to imitate the manoeuvre in order to keep his squadron together; but he did so with some order, keeping some ships around him, and was joined by one of the van ships, disgusted with the conduct of his immediate superior. Tromp was now in great danger, separated by his own act first, and then by the conduct of the van, from his own fleet by the English, and would have been destroyed but for Ruyter, who, seeing the urgency of the case, hauled up for him, the van and centre thus standing back for the rear on the opposite tack to that on which they entered action. This prevented the English from keeping up the attack on Tromp, lest Ruyter should gain the wind of them, which they could not afford to yield because of their very inferior numbers. Both the action of Tromp and that of the junior flag officers in the van, though showing very different degrees of warlike ardor, bring out strongly the lack of subordination and of military feeling which has been charged against the Dutch officers as a body, no signs of which appear among the English at this time. How keenly Ruyter felt the conduct of his lieutenants was manifested when Tromp, immediately after this partial action, went on board his flagship. The seamen cheered him, but Ruyter said, "This is no time for rejoicing, but rather for tears." Indeed, our position was bad, each squadron acting differently in no line, and all the ships huddled together like a flock of sheep, so packed that the English might have surrounded all of them with their 40 ships. The English were in admirable order, but did not push their advantage as they should, whatever the reason. The reason, no doubt, was the same that often prevented sailing ships from pressing an advantage, disability from crippled spars and rigging, added to the inexpediency of such inferior numbers risking a decisive action. Ruyter was thus able to draw his fleet out into line again, although much maltreated by the English, and the 2 fleets passed again on opposite tacks, the Dutch to leeward and Ruyter's ship the last in his column. As he passed the English rear, he lost his main-topmast and mainyard. After another partial rencounter, the English drew away to the northwest toward their own shores, the Dutch following them, the wind being still from southwest but light. The English were now fairly in retreat, and the pursuit continued all night, Ruyter's own ship dropping out of sight in the rear from her crippled state. The third day Monk continued retreating to the westward. He burned, by the English accounts, 3 disabled ships, sent ahead those that were most crippled, and himself brought up the rear with those that were in fighting condition, which are variously stated, again by the English, at 28 and 16 in number. One of the largest and finest of the English fleet, the Royal Prince, of 90 guns, ran aground on the Galloper Shoal and was taken by Tromp; but Monk's retreat was so steady and orderly that he was otherwise unmolested. This shows that the Dutch had suffered very severely. Toward evening Rupert's squadron was seen, and all the ships of the English fleet, except those crippled in action, were at last united. The next day the wind came out again, very fresh from the southwest, giving the Dutch the weather gage. The English, instead of attempting to pass upon opposite tacks, came up from astern, relying upon the speed and handiness of their ships. So doing, the battle engaged all along the line on the port tack, the English to leeward. The Dutch fire ships were badly handled and did no harm, whereas the English burned 2 of their enemies. The 2 fleets ran on thus, exchanging broadsides for 2 hours, at the end of which time the bulk of the English fleet had passed through the Dutch line. All regularity of order was henceforward lost. At this moment, says the eye-witness, the lookout was extraordinary, for all were separated, the English as well as we. But luck would have it that the largest of our fractions surrounding the admiral remained to windward, and the largest fraction of the English also, with their admiral, remained to leeward. This was the cause of our victory and their ruin. Our admiral had with him 35 or 40 ships of his own and of other squadrons, for the squadrons were scattered and order much lost. The rest of the Dutch ships had left him. The leader of the van, Van Ness, had gone off with 14 ships in chase of 3 or 4 English ships, which under a press of sail had gained to windward of the Dutch van. Van Tromp, with the rear squadron, had fallen to leeward, and so had to keep on, to leeward of Ruyter and the English main body, after Van Ness, in order to rejoin the admiral by passing round the English centre. De Ruyter and the English main body kept up a sharp action, beating to windward all the time. Tromp, having carried sail, overtook Van Ness and returned, bringing the van back with him; but owing to the constant plying to windward of the English main body, he came up to leeward of it, and could not rejoin Ruyter, who was to windward. Ruyter, seeing this, made signal to the ships around him, and the main body of the Dutch kept away before the wind, which was then very strong. Thus, in less than no time, we found ourselves in the midst of the English, who, being attacked on both sides, were thrown into confusion, and saw their whole order destroyed, as well by dint of the action as by the strong wind that was then blowing. This was the hottest of the fight. We saw the High Admiral of England separated from his fleet, followed only by 1 fire ship. With that he gained to windward, and passing through the North Holland squadron, placed himself again at the head of 15 or 20 ships that rallied to him. Thus ended this great sea fight, the most remarkable in some of its aspects that has ever been fought upon the ocean. Amid conflicting reports it is not possible to do more than estimate the results. A fairly impartial account says the States lost in these actions 3 vice admirals, 2,000 men, and 4 ships. The loss of the English was 5,000 killed and 3,000 prisoners, and they lost besides 17 ships, of which 9 remained in the hands of the victors. There is no doubt that the English had much the worst of it, and that this was owing wholly to the original blunder of weakening the fleet by a great detachment sent in another direction. Great detachments are sometimes necessary evils, but in this case no necessity existed. Granting the approach of the French, the proper course for the English was to fall with their whole fleet upon the Dutch before their allies could come up. This lesson is as applicable today as it ever was. A second lesson, likewise of present application, is the necessity of sound military institutions for implanting correct military feeling, pride, and discipline. Great as was the first splendor of the English, and serious as was the disaster, there can be no doubt that the consequences would have been much worse, but for the high spirit and skill with which the plans of Monk were carried out by his subordinates, and the lack of similar support to Ruyter on the part of the Dutch subalterns. In the movements of the English we hear nothing of two juniors turning tail at a critical moment, nor of a third, with misdirected ardor, getting on the wrong side of the enemy's fleet. Their drill also, their tactical precision, was remarked even then. The Frenchman De Guiche, after witnessing this 4 days' fight, wrote: "Nothing equals the beautiful order of the English at sea. Never was a line drawn straighter than that formed by their ships. Thus they bring all their fire to bear upon those who draw near them. They fight like a line of cavalry which is handled according to rule, and applies itself solely to force back those who oppose; whereas the Dutch advance like cavalry whose squadrons leave their ranks and come separately to the charge." The Dutch government, averse to expense, unmilitary in its tone, and incautious from long and easy victory over the degenerate navy of Spain, had allowed its fleet to sink into a mere assembly of armed merchantmen. Things were at their worst in the days of Cromwell. Taught by the severe lessons of that war, the United Provinces, under an able ruler, had done much to mend matters, but full efficiency had not yet been gained. In 1666, as in 1653, says a French naval writer, the fortune of war seemed to lean to the side of the English. Of the 3 great battles fought, 2 were decided victories, and the third, though adverse, had but increased the glory of her seamen. This was due to the intelligent boldness of Monk and Rupert, the talents of part of the admirals and captains, and the skill of the seamen and soldiers under them, the wise and vigorous efforts made by the government of the United Provinces, and the undeniable superiority of Ruyter in experience and genius over any one of his opponents could not compensate for the weakness or incapacity of part of the Dutch officers and the manifest inferiority of the men under their orders. England, as has been said before, still felt the impress of Cromwell's iron hand upon her military institutions, but that impress was growing weaker. Before the next Dutch war Monk was dead, and was poorly replaced by the cavalier Rupert. Court extravagance cut down the equipment of the navy, as did the burgomaster's parsimony, and court corruption undermined discipline as surely as commercial indifference. The effect was evident when the fleets of the two countries met again 6 years later. End of Chapter 2, Part 2.